Give us an idea what social commerce actually is then.
Well, social commerce is any form of e-commerce that really leverages social interactions to convince us to buy things. And I think this trend really took off in the pandemic. I think, so many of us have been stuck at home and craving social interaction that, the idea of shopping with others, with friends, has really taken off. It's become the fastest growing segment. Probably the company that is doing the most innovative things in social commerce is, one of the big Chinese big tech giants that most people in the West don't know about. That's Pinduodo. And they have innovated a very interesting business model around group and team-based buying, where people get together in the platform, they form a group, and then they go negotiate very good prices with vendors. It's part of this direct-to-consumer model that has been very innovative, and they're really challenging some of the bigger Chinese big techs like Alibaba and JD, really taking off.
Well, absolutely. So,
in fact,
how do these business models then benefit also normal social media platforms? Are they taking notice of this?
That's absolutely right. In fact, we can probably say that social commerce 1.0 was really started by Instagram and Facebook. They have a very different model. It's based on influencers. We all know these popular people on Instagram, and they really drive sales through advertising and through promotion. So it's really supplier driven. They'll link up with an influencer. But Pinduoduo's model is very different. Their model is demand or consumer driven. Consumers getting together and deciding, when they would like to buy. And as a result, this model has no need for an influencer who takes a huge share of the profits. So I think companies like Facebook have really realized that this might be the new wave. And you can imagine, they've started to invest in this new form of social commerce as well. So we've started to see, Facebook and Instagram innovating with what they call shops, which allow, small vendors to organize some of these groups. They've also started to do customized audiences, basically copying the Pinduoduo model with a team-based buying approach. So it's really become, I think there's a quiet revolution happening in social commerce that, a lot of us aren't talking about yet. But when you start to see,
Absolutely.
a company take on Alibaba and JD, I think it's really happening now.
Jason, so you talk about influencers, which are very important in the development of social media websites in the West. How does influencers work with a company like Pinduodo?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So, of course, there are prominent people on the Pinduoduo website, and they tend to use live streaming to help to organize these groups. What's interesting, though, is that vendors are not reliant on those people. They may be there, they're helping to organize the groups, but they don't take such a large share of the profits. Whereas if you look over at Instagram, the influencers are the most prominent people, even more prominent than the brands in many times. People like the Kardashians, they really have made quite a business for themselves. You don't see that over in demand-driven, team-based social commerce. It seems to be more demand and consumer-driven.
Jason, when you take a look at these e-commerce companies, they're coming under greater scrutiny. We're seeing this in the U.S. We're seeing this in China. Could regulation impact innovation? What's the outlook for these companies?
I think it's going to be the big topic probably for these companies in 2021. And it's interesting, it's happening in parallel. It's not just the US where we're seeing, obviously a great fanfare happened over social media in the past week there, but we're also seeing it happening in China too, with investigations into Alibaba and some interest in Pinduoduo. So how these companies manage their government relations, how they respond to some of these criticisms, may determine if they actually succeed. But nonetheless, while that regulation and those geopolitical things are happening, underneath it all, there is innovation. And the regulators need to create a space that allows that innovation to thrive. And it's not just in China, of course. I mean, we're seeing a social revolution happening in the US. Many of the hottest companies worldwide are employing more of a social model. So I'm thinking new hot companies like Clubhouse and Discord. And for any of us who have little kids, we play little games like Among Us and Roblox and, of course, TikTok. These things all have much more interactivity to them, much more like games and social interactions than the sort of things that we saw before. So it's likely to continue, whether regulators get involved or not.
What's also under scrutiny is the culture, the working conditions of these e-commerce companies. We've had maybe an incident at PDD, for instance, where one worker collapsed and died. Yet these e-commerce companies endorse the culture. They say that's what's needed because it's such a competitive space. Can they continue to do that? How much pressure is there for that to change? Will it change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I saw the news too about some of these deaths at PDD, and I think anytime anyone loses their life due to overwork, it's a tragedy. I think the company should investigate and try to improve conditions. And I actually think they will. As they become more prominent, they will respond to that pressure. But it is important to understand maybe the context of why that's happening. It's part of a larger competition that's playing out in e-commerce in China, particularly with Alibaba and JD. So PDD has come out of nowhere to challenge their supremacy. And now, of course, Alibaba and JD are trying to imitate and copy and move into that social space. So that obviously creates a very ultra competitive strategic environment when you have the two biggest big techs coming for your lunch with your new innovative model. So I'm sure that's being translated into more pressure inside the company to work even harder. I mean, I'm sure folks are saying, well, if they can work this hard at Alibaba and Tencent and JD, we need to have at least that level of intensity to be able to keep up with them. So I expect that this pressure will continue, and I hope that companies like Pinduodo can put in place some sort of features, some sort of limits on the overwork that can happen, that can obviously lead to really bad outcomes and health problems and family problems and other things.
Jason, interesting to note that for Chinese e-commerce companies, on the one hand, they're getting clamped down by the government. On the other, the U.S. is trying to limit that growth. How will this play out?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not an expert on what's happening in U.S. regulation, but there does appear to be a trend. I think that most of the regulations are concerning infrastructure companies, companies that have the capability of interfacing with telecommunications infrastructure or maybe commercial and financial technology. So most of the regulations so far have been focused on those things. And what that means is it's left e-commerce mostly open. You haven't seen as many regulations going after companies like Alibaba or JD or Pinduodo from the U.S. regulators. And as long as that continues to be the focus, that U.S. regulators see that national security interest is best served by focusing on infrastructure, I would expect that e-commerce would continue to thrive, both in China and in all the other markets where these players operate. And I think you probably know I'm thinking Southeast Asia. There's been a big push by a lot of Chinese and other companies to develop e-commerce in Southeast Asia. And I would expect that would continue to thrive as long as regulatory burden doesn't focus on e-commerce.